Shalom and welcome to the Israel Policy Pod. I'm Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and a policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. Happy New Year to all our listeners and viewers. And what a new year it's already proving to be. Hope the various holidays were enjoyable for all of you, but we're now back to regular programming. And back with us this week is Dr. Naysan Rafati, the senior Iran analyst at the International Crisis Group in Washington, to talk about what should have been the biggest news of the current moment before Venezuela, but trust me, is still very big news. Naysan, of course, was previously a postdoc fellow at the RAND Corporation, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the IFRI think tank in Paris. He also holds a doctorate from Oxford University and is, more importantly, a friend of the pod and a dear friend of mine. But let's not hold that against him. Naysan and I discussed the unrest roiling Iran, with over a week of protests and demonstrations across the country continuing against the regime. And we tried to answer three questions. Basically, how serious of a threat is this really to the Islamic Republic? What does President Donald Trump mean when he says he'll come to the Iranian people's rescue? And should we be worried that another Israel-Iran confrontation is in the offing? All of that and much more coming up in what was a terrific conversation. But first, a few quick thoughts from me. So we're recording this on Monday night Tel Aviv time, January 5th, 2026. The start of a new year, and you may be shocked to hear that nothing has really been resolved since some of you went on holiday a few weeks ago. Trust me, I'm not bitter or jealous, but nothing has really been resolved since, the end of 2025. Benjamin Netanyahu had a great visit to Mar-a-Lago last week to meet with President Trump, who showered him with praise. Trump said Israel wouldn't have survived without Netanyahu at the helm. Fine. And for Netanyahu and his wife Sarah, their big hit and thrill was the invitation to Trump's New Year's Eve bash at Mar-a-Lago. So all of this was manna from heaven, really, for Bibi as he enters into an election year back home here in Israel. But the real question is what was decided between Netanyahu and Trump and between the U.S. and Israel with regard to the various other fronts still in play across the Middle East. So in particular, we're talking about Gaza, where we're expecting some kind of announcement in the next week or two, so very soon, on the ceasefire agreement and the so-called phase 2 of the deal that was struck back in October. There's still a lot of things to work out, shall we say, with regard to phase 2 and next steps in the ceasefire. Believe me, there's still a lot to work out, but that likely won't stop the Trump administration from announcing some kind of movement and some kind of progress, including most likely the announcement of a board of peace and an executive committee and a committee of Palestinian technocrats who are all set to run the Gaza Strip. Now, what these various bodies will actually do on the ground and what they'll be able to do on the ground, no one actually knows yet. Trust me, I've tried to find out. That's number one. Number two, in Lebanon, the ceasefire isn't going all that much better. Hezbollah has yet to fully disarm. The Lebanese government is still, for its part, treading very lightly when it comes to disarming Hezbollah. And Israel continues to basically strike across the country on a daily basis at will, including earlier today. Trump in Mar-a-Lago last week said something that actually caught my ear and was quite striking on this issue of Lebanon. Trump said that Hezbollah was, quote, behaving badly. Not that Hezbollah may be behaving badly, or that if Hezbollah behaves badly, then X, Y, and Z will happen. Trump stated it as fact. Now, out of all the various fronts currently still in play in the Middle East and, well, all across the world, this is the one that many, especially here in Israel, are most concerned about in terms of potential escalation in the near term. So just FYI, the pros here in Israel are, everyone's talking about Gaza and other places, but Lebanon may be the actual shoe to drop in the near term. And finally, and obviously, there's Iran. But for that, let's get to Naysan Rafati. Hi, Naysan. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Neri. It's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
It's really our pleasure, especially this week of all weeks, Naysan. By the way, happy 2026 to you, such as it is.
Such as it is, yes. It's, the Iranian year runs through March, but it's already been a rough one for the Iranian government.
Yeah, rough one for the Iranian government. I think a rough one for the Venezuelan government as well, which we'll obliquely touch on, I think, later on. The Jewish New Year obviously started a few months ago. I don't know if, it's a better Jewish New Year, I suppose. So there is that silver lining. But a lot to discuss on this episode. And before we get into the Israel and the Trump and the maybe Venezuela of it all, I really wanted to start here with the most kind of basic table setting exercise to explain to us, both me and our listeners and viewers, basically what's been happening in Iran over the past week since, I believe, last Sunday, in terms of the unrest, the demonstrations that we've been seeing on the streets of Tehran and many other places all across the country. What's been happening and also why now?
Thanks. Well, as we're speaking right now, we've just entered the second week of these nationwide demonstrations that started with an economic spark. The Iranian economy writ large has been in a very difficult position, and particularly towards late December, there was essentially a free fall of the national currency, with the Iranian rial kind of tumbling through a million rial to the dollar to 1.1 to 1.2. It's currently 1.4. And for context, when the current president of Iran, President Pezeshkian, took office in mid-2024, it was 600,000.
Oh, wow.
And so that sparked the initial round of demonstrations and strikes in the Tehran bazaar. But as has been the case in other rounds of Iranian protests over the past decade, what starts from a particular grievance or a particular issue, whether it's economic or social, it quickly kind of evolves into a wider kind of demonstration of protests against the system, demonstrations against the Islamic Republic. And so over the past week, we've seen the rise of protests around the country. We've seen state security forces respond with force in many instances, at least 20 fatalities reported. And I think your listeners and viewers will know that Iran has not been a stranger to these protests over the past decade. In 2017, late 2018, 19, and then again in 2022, we've had various rounds sparked by particular incidents, but quickly kind of emerging into significant kind of challenges against the state from below.
And that's a good jumping off point. I mean, give us some context, right? So you're saying the current unrest, the current demonstrations are entering their second week. We're recording this again Monday night Tel Aviv time, noonish DC time, where you're situated, Naysan. But how does these protests compare to previous protests, whether in 2022 or the previous ones, even to that, the economic ones, or even the 2009 so-called Green Revolution or Green Movement, which came after a stolen election in Iran, which seemed fairly significant just in terms of the size.
Yeah, I don't think that at this point, as of recording, the numbers are anywhere approaching 2009 levels. But I think that there's an element of a regime playbook whenever these protests come up, which is on the one hand to say, we recognize that there are some grievances, and even in the past week, President Pezeshkian, even Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, have said, yeah, the economic situation is not great. We understand that. We'll do what we can. We'll try to increase handouts. We'll try to address mismanagement and corruption. But in 2022, Khamenei, after the death of Mahsa Amini, said, this was terrible. But that kind of rhetorical flourish and nod to some of the grievances that give lie to these different protests is also accompanied by drawing the iron fist and repressing these protests. And for all of the rhetoric around, we feel your pain type of rhetoric coming from the top, the grievances accumulate, right? They're not really addressed at any significant point. So whether it's the economy right now, whether it's the social and political repression that people have demonstrated against. The system doesn't really make any major course adjustments. It uses repression and then essentially tries to buy time and space. And as a result, we see these almost metronomic ebb and flow of these protests, especially over the past decade, where the spark may vary from time to time, but the tinder just continues to accumulate. And the economic grievances, the social grievances, the political grievances, they continue to compound.
Right. And just for listeners, Mahsa Amini was obviously the Iranian Kurdish woman who was detained back in 2022 and, beaten to death in custody by the Iranian security forces. And that sparked, nationwide protests that were also, like you said, put down eventually. I'm curious, Naysan, you mentioned the rial and the kind of economic trigger for the current unrest. According to previous reports kind of going back a few weeks and a few months, there also seemed to be, I suppose, an energy crisis in Iran, which seems kind of remarkable given, the Iranian oil and gas deposits. It also seemed like there was no water previously in the summer. I mean, give us some context in terms of, yes, there is an economic trigger, an economic collapse, especially in the currency, but what other societal and infrastructure ills was ailing the Islamic Republic?
I mean, you can go down a fairly significant list, right? There's decades of mismanagement, corruption. Obviously, there's an impact from sanctions as well, which limit the government exchequer. But over the summer, there were water concerns due to the lack of rainfall. The infrastructure grid is creaking, which has led to power outages and things like that. And then the economy, since 2018, really, when the U.S. Under the first Trump administration introduced maximum pressure, the Iranian government has touted its ability to respond with what it calls a resistance economy, and that is like the blueprint for this idea is that Iran, by conducting enough oil sales, building up trade with regional allies and non-sanctioned, trade in goods and things like that, developing domestic capacity, that it can get by. And what I think we've seen is that it doesn't really work that well. Inflation right now is above 40%. We talked about the fall of the rial. Unemployment remains a consideration. Investment into things like the electricity grid, water infrastructure, sustainable resources, all of those things when Iran faces kind of fairly acute environmental strains as well. All of these things, again, compound into a pretty dire malaise, which again the system doesn't really have good answers to. At best, it can muddle through, and there are countries that have worse inflation rates. There are countries that have gone through worse currency falls and things like that. But it really is a kind of accumulation of immediate triggers, but then also kind of medium and long term strains on the environment, on the economy, on infrastructure that, again, have no easy solutions and certainly not ones that the system's been able to find.
Right. Muddling through tried and true formula, not only in Iran, until, it becomes a lot harder to muddle through. Naysan, as a close watcher of Iran, can you give us a sense who is actually going out and protesting on the streets? So you mentioned initially it was in the Tehran bazaar. I know there's some unrest and protests at various universities. I mean, who is actually going out and coming out?
Well, it started in the bazaar. It also then spread to some university campuses. It's spread, in terms of the geographic scope of it, it's dozens of cities right now. It's also, difficult to get a full picture. We see videos that come from abroad. We do get reporting from human rights organizations that have sources that are able to share what they can from what they see in Iran. So in terms of geographic scope, it's dozens of cities. It's a lot of youth that are out there. The government has tried to staunch the flow by announcing various closures, saying that campuses are moved online or shutting down businesses and things like that. So They're trying to limit the scale and the scope of it. And with these things, it's obviously very difficult to predict trajectories, right? Like, how does it, do these things, does the crackdown mean that over time they start to ebb again? Does it mean that it only fuels, further outrage and gives new waves of protests? I mean, the Masa Amini protests, they started in September, and they kept going for several months. And in some cases, in Sistan and Baluchistan province, it went on for, close to a year. Every week people would come out, because that was one of the places where the crackdown had been the most severe, especially in Zahedan. So predicting the trajectory of these things is extremely difficult. I mean, clearly it speaks to a degree of dissatisfaction and discontent that is against the system writ large. But in terms of whether we will continue to see it grow or whether we'll start to see it ebb, that's very difficult. And there's obviously an X factor that's come in as well, which is the system has, as we discussed, faced several instances of these major uprisings from below. Now we also have an added element, an X factor of President Trump, at least twice at the moment we've spoken. We're speaking right now, warning the Iranians that there could be some sort of U.S. intervention if the crackdown continues. He mentioned this in a Truth Social tweet a few days ago, and again yesterday, Sunday, our time here in Washington,
right.
During a gaggle, said that if the Iranians continue to do this, we will hit them hard. So what that necessarily looks like, whether we're talking about go on.
No, I was going to say, hold that thought, because we're going to get into the president's threats and what that could actually mean in practice. And also, more intriguing for me is how these threats are understood by the Islamic Republic and the regime in Tehran. But I'm curious, just in terms of the current moment, and to put a bow on where we are before we kind of further explain how we got here and then looking ahead. What has been the actual response over the past week by the Iranian authorities? So you said, obviously, the iron fist and casualties on the streets and the use of force. Have there been other, say, more conciliatory steps taken by the Islamic Republic to try to mollify the public?
There have been both attempts at conciliatory rhetoric and also, threatening rhetoric. So Khamenei himself addressed this a few days ago. He said, people might have some grievances that, and if they're protesting, that's one thing. If they're rioting, that's another thing. Now, you can argue the extent to which the Iranian system sees those things as a distinction without a difference. And then Pezeshkian, who's been president for the past year and a half, has kind of harped on this a lot and said, we are facing difficulties. We're facing economic difficulties. We're facing social and political difficulties. He also then kind of intimates that he can't do that much about them. What do you do with these kind of very negative fundamentals?
What he basically said, what do you want from me? I'm just the president.
You're paraphrasing, but not very far off. But again, the question is, so right now they can do certain things, right? They can try to increase handouts and subsidies, right, and give people basically a small cash infusion. The risk there is that you raise inflation because prices will go up. So the fact is that these are not problems that came up last week. And if we're focusing only on the economic side of the equation, forget about the social and political elements for a moment. The Iranian government is under kind of suffering from internal mismanagement, internal corruption, and external financial pressure, where it's able to export oil, it's not necessarily able to repatriate all of that oil, or if it is, it goes to at least a portion of the proceeds may go to various intermediaries that don't necessarily end up funding public services. And
that's a very nice way of saying corruption.
Corruption, yes.
Yeah.
But these notions of regional trade and things like that. Again, trade with Europe is basically nil. A lot of Iran's regional neighbors export the same commodities that Iran exports. There's some, fruit and vegetable trade. There's obviously very active trade between the UAE and Iran. But it's like the fundamentals on the economy have not been very good. And when growth is projected to be negative this year, when inflation is running above 40%, when you've got the currency volatility that you have, you need to make some pretty major, either be able to make some very significant cuts in how much you're spending, or have a major injection of revenue somehow. And the first one requires unhappiness, facing unhappiness from whoever's money is being cut.
Even more unhappiness than the unhappiness being exhibited on the streets right now.
Correct. Yeah. And the second one would require some kind of lifting of sanctions, normalization of Iran's trade, being able to repatriate the funds that it actually gets, being able to export oil again, and again have access to the revenue. And as far as that is concerned, again, diplomacy with the U.S. right now looks moribund.
Right, and that's a very good jumping off point to the next topic I wanted to tackle, kind of zooming out from the current moment, the current week, to the past, 2 years, and really the past 6 months since the 12-day war between Israel and Iran. Last time you were on this podcast, Naysan, was way back in April of 2025. It seems like a different world, although in some respects it's the same exact world. But you actually, back then, we didn't quite know or predict that a war was just over the horizon. But what you did say was that diplomacy was going to be proven very, very difficult between Iran and the U.S. And that was back then in the spring of 2025. That was Trump's effort right after he retook power and retook office to kind of engage Iran diplomatically. That went nowhere, and then Trump greenlit Israel's attack in June. So I guess my first question to you, Naysan, is, okay, what impact at all, if any, have the past 2 years of war across the Middle East and also directly between Iran and Israel had on the Islamic Republic that brought it to this point, whether politically, economically, or otherwise?
So if we spoke in April of 2025, by that point, the trend line for Iran was bad, and then it continued to get worse. So, starting in autumn of 2024, about a year after the 7th of October and Israel's kind of counter campaign, first against Hamas and then increasingly against the axis of resistance writ large. By that point, if you go back and think of where things were in April of 2025, Iran had essentially lost Hamas. It had largely lost Hezbollah, certainly as a deterrent force against Israel. It had lost Assad, and
in Syria.
In Syria. And so that was all essentially the autumn of 2024. And it came to these negotiations with the Trump administration in a position that, it has a significant degree of nuclear leverage remaining. It was enriching at 60%. It had we had limited inspections from the International Atomic Energy Agency. And Trump had basically come in with both a expansion of maximum pressure sanctions, but also this diplomatic overture conducted through a special envoy. Yes.
No, Steve Witkoff was the envoy.
Steve Witkoff. Yes. And initially it seemed like things were off to a decent start, but then we ran into the same problems that have bedeviled international diplomacy over Iran's nuclear program for more than 2 decades, which is this issue of enrichment. The Iranians said that we're willing to restrict the nuclear program, we're willing to increase inspections, but we're not willing to stop enrichment. And the Trump administration's position consolidated itself on zero enrichment being the standard that the U.S. would accept. The Iranians rejected that, and so on the Friday the 13th of June, we saw Israel launch its military operation against Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missile program. Senior IRGC officials, senior Iranian armed forces officials, senior Iranian nuclear scientists, and later on, the U.S. come in as well in an offensive capacity with Operation Midnight Hammer against Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan.
Right.
So if you look at it from a quasi-neutral perspective, right, that war, first of all, showed that, first of all, it left the upper ranks of Iran's military and nuclear echelons fairly decimated. Mm-hmm. It showed that Iran's air defenses were extremely vulnerable. It showed that Iran's offensive capacity, particularly in the form of ballistic missiles and especially drones, were largely repellable by Israeli and allied defenses. Mm-hmm. And an utter upper hand in terms of Israeli intelligence capacity, right? In terms of being able to pinpoint where all of these Iranian officials were, being able to build drone factories on Iranian soil and conduct drone operations from Iranian territory. But in the Iranian state narrative, there's also a victory there. And the victory is that, first of all, despite all of this, the system survived. The system was able to maintain the chain of command. All of the commanders who were killed were quickly replaced. The missile capacity was able to muster 2 weeks' worth of regular salvos against Israel. And that, in their view, an attritional conflict that would have lasted longer would have been to their advantage, which is why the U.S. and Israel agreed to an unconditional ceasefire. That is the state narrative. That is what Iranian officials contend when they say that actually, if we had been on the back foot, Washington and Jerusalem wouldn't have agreed to a ceasefire.
Right.
And the fact that we were still standing by the end of the 12 days shows that actually they recognize that we were better in the long game. And that the damage to the nuclear facilities was significant, but not to the technology, not to the knowledge, and that the ballistic missile capacity was the damage wasn't that bad. Those are the narratives that come
very interesting.
Out of the.
No, it's very interesting. Okay, continue. So this is their narrative coming out of last June. That's
the narrative. Now, narrative doesn't always comport to reality. And I think it also has put the Iranians in a very difficult position, even before these protests. And to a certain degree, facing a series of difficult options, they've taken none of them. So from a certain perspective, like on the nuclear program, for example, they have not conducted anything that would be regarded as a major provocation, because one of the things that they don't know is what is Israel's red line, or what is the U.S. red line on nuclear reconstitution. Mm-hmm. And so de facto, they have been at zero enrichment for 7 months. As far as we know, Iran has not rebuilt or certainly resumed uranium enrichment. Now, there are a lot of questions around the status of Iran's nuclear program. We haven't had international inspectors on the ground since mid-June. We do not have absolute clarity. We have a sense that the fissile material is inaccessible and buried at the various enrichment sites, but we don't know that with an absolute certainty. That includes 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, which is near weapons grade, and I think Prime Minister Netanyahu alluded to today speaking at the Knesset. But they not knowing both the degree of continued intelligence penetration and the red lines that could prompt a resumption of strikes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, on the nuclear front, whether it's because of the damage sustained or the risks that they could incur, they have not really taken dramatic steps to reconstitute that activity. There's been cleanup efforts and things like that, but as far as we know, no resumption of enrichment. At the same time, they continue to insist that they would want enrichment in a new deal with the United States. The fact that the United States is saying there can be no zero enrichment means that there's no point in negotiating. So on the one hand, they're essentially doing what the U.S. has asked, but on the other hand, refusing to acknowledge that as a diplomatic concession.
Not reaping any of the benefits of this de facto policy they've adopted over the past 6 months.
That's right. And then on the ballistic missile side, we know, and Israeli intelligence has also said, and IRGC officials boast about it regularly, that they are trying to rebuild the nuclear program. Iranian officials will say that actually the damage sustained wasn't that big to begin with. But we've seen, reports citing Western intelligence about shipments coming in from China that can be used towards fueling ballistic missiles. Apparently, the U.S. interdicted a shipment a few months ago that was coming from China. These are things that can be used towards ballistic missile development. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, when he was visiting with President Trump in Mar-a-Lago, has made the case that Iran's missile program is rehabilitating. President Trump said that either the nuclear or the missile programs could be cause for a resumption of either Israeli and or U.S. strikes. But again, right, we don't quite know what the threshold is, and I would be surprised if the Israelis made much effort to publicly enunciate what that red line is, because if the Iranians don't know, they may err on the side of not crossing it. But either on the nuclear program or on the ballistic missile program, there is continued concern in Israel, as you well know. President Trump has indicated that it could very well be a trigger for renewed strikes. And on the Iranian side, fairly coy in terms of nuclear activity, but trying to do what they can at the very minimum to rehabilitate the ballistic missile capacity, which was really their only kind of tool against Israel during the war.
Right. So I'm going to get back to the missiles in just a second. Believe me, I'm very curious to get your take on one particular aspect of that. But from the sounds of it, you're basically saying that, especially after the 12-day war last June, the Iranian leadership has essentially decided not to decide, right? Not on diplomacy with the U.S., not on economic reforms, not on, proactive aggression against Israel or not. I mean, basically a whole host of issues that they've essentially not either wanted to decide on or been able to decide on. Is that fair?
I mean, non-decision is a form of decision in and of itself. But yeah, I think that there's an element of paralysis facing very difficult choices, of just not of trying to, again, like with the economy, muddle through and keep your head down and try to get by. The diplomacy with the U.S. Is a case in point. They despite the war in June, they really haven't shifted any of their positions. And in terms of what they want out of what they're willing to offer in a deal with the U.S. The insistence on a domestic enrichment capacity, notwithstanding the fact that for 6+ months there has been no domestic enrichment capacity,
correct,
remains something that they won't budge on. And for them, it's also, they say, and that the U.S. is also demanding much more than that. They're demanding limits on missiles. They're demanding limits on proxies. So, if you concede on one, it becomes a slippery slope that even then may not satisfy the administration. Flip side of it is that if you don't agree to that, the economic situation, as we have seen, doesn't get any better. And while you can try to rehabilitate your conventional systems, they too could get you to a point where the Israelis are sufficiently seeing threat and opportunity, because Iran's air defenses, did not turn out to be a ringing endorsement for the S-300 systems in June or in October of 2024. And so again, that vulnerability may be something that bears bearing in mind, I suppose, for what the calculus is in Israel and the U.S.
Israel Policy Forum is a policy organization rooted in the Jewish community. Our mission is to build support for a secure, Jewish, democratic Israel through a viable resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, advancing pragmatic U.S. policy towards the conflict, U.S.-Israel relations, and regional diplomacy among policymakers and community leaders. We promote policy measures endorsed by credible security experts, develop analysis and commentary, and convene programs that engage and educate leaders across the political, denominational, and generational spectrums. Our Young Professionals Initiative, IPF at Teen, works to elevate the discourse among next-generation leaders by building community and facilitating engaging programs related to Israeli-Palestinian affairs. To learn more about our work, visit us online at israelpolicyforum.org and follow us on social media. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible and nuanced analysis, please make a tax-deductible gift today at ipf.li/supportthepod or at the Support the Show link in the show notes.
I mean, I had two questions before I get to the missiles. Trust me, I'm going to get back to the missiles. But how much of a problem is it inside the Iranian system in terms of, their lack of ability to take decisions? Is related to the fact that the supreme leader is both quite old already, and also perhaps diminished, if not personally, then publicly and politically, after the humiliation of the 12-day war, where he essentially just kind of disappeared. In other words, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who's been in power since the late 80s, after he took over from Khomeini, is he now part of the problem? Is he not, sorry for the pun, is he not so supreme anymore?
Well, I think, it's interesting because, his title is Supreme Leader. And there are people who work on Iran that will make the argument, I think with some merit, that Supreme Decision Maker is a bit more of an accurate title, right? He doesn't make decisions without context. There is a policy process within the system. There's a Supreme National Security Council in the system that brings together the president and the head of the parliament and the various eminences, degrees of the system. And then they present essentially a set of recommendations to him that he gives a thumbs up or a thumbs down to. And for the most part, he takes their recommendations. Every once in a while, he might cast a veto on it. But
by the way, does he only not have one working hand? So it would only be really one thumb heading up, right?
Sure.
Okay. You didn't like that. You didn't like that joke.
No, it's he does have an injury in one of his hands as a result of a bombing in the early 80s.
Right.
But the fact is that I think with it, so the problem, such as it is in terms of decision making, is that there's a bigger systemic paralysis, right? And you have some people in the system who are more hardline, who say the problem with June is that we didn't go big enough, and the problem with the nuclear program is that we hedged and we should have gone bigger, faster, quicker.
Full breakout.
When because what has been the point of being at 60%, which is enough to pose a threat, but not enough to actually, have the nuclear deterrent. And then there are other people who, will say that, look, how does this end essentially? Like, what is, how do we get this economic reprieve? How do we de-escalate tensions with the U.S., not necessarily with Israel, because that is an ideological foundation that very few will be willing to openly, question. But again, these are all, if a deal with the U.S. requires compromising on this issue that the Iranian system has made a fundamental point of principle for 23, 24 years of nuclear diplomacy. And even then, you don't know whether the U.S. would accept it. And even if the U.S. accepts it, you don't know if the U.S. would follow through. It leads to, I think, a degree of systemic paralysis. And Khamenei being Khamenei and being the age he is and being in the position he's been in, is probably not, pushing for radical ideas at this point. But when you're dealing with fairly unprecedented conditions in terms of the ability of Iran to project power through the axis of resistance, the failure of its deterrence through conventional missiles, the fact that the nuclear leverage is now not in what Iran has in terms of nuclear capacity, but what we don't know about its nuclear capacity, right? It used to be that the leverage was the growth, the expansion of its nuclear program. Mm-hmm. Right now, it's the opacity of the program. It's the fact that we don't know with absolute certainty where those 400 kilograms of 60% are. Are there centrifuges squirreled away? because the IAEA hasn't had access for a couple of years to centrifuge production sites. And the Israelis targeted some of the known production sites, right? It's not just Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan. It's not just the enrichment sites. It's also, the bigger nuclear infrastructure where you're actually building parts and putting together centrifuges and all of that stuff. So that is essentially what they are playing with on the nuclear side of the equation. But what they also don't know is how much the Israelis or the Americans or allied intelligence agencies are able to see right now.
Mm-hmm.
So if there was a clique saying, we need to take some of that 400 kilograms of 60% enrichment uranium and marry it with some of the centrifuges that may not have been accounted for, may not have been destroyed, and then essentially, try to have a crash program, they have, I think, zero confidence, or should have zero confidence in their ability to do that in a covert and undetected manner.
Right. So risks any way you look, and hence the paralysis, especially in the form of the supreme decision maker, who is not making any real decisions except not making decisions.
That's right.
Okay. Glad I got that all worked out, and which, is a good explanation for how the Islamic Republic finds itself in the current situation it is. As promised, I wanted to just circle back really quick to the issue of Iran's ballistic missiles. So I went back into my notes from last summer, and I looked at the various pieces of information I got from various sources on my end here in Israel. And I wanted to kind of do some back-of-the-envelope math with you, Naysan, and then kind of try to understand where we are in terms of specifically the missile program and the missile threat that we've been hearing now for definitely a month, if not longer, from the Israeli side, saying, this is the real threat. Iran is rebuilding and reconstituting its ballistic missile arsenal, and that, as you mentioned, it could be a trigger for future and further military action, whether by Israel alone or, with a green light or active support of Donald Trump. But again, on the eve of the June 2025 12-day war, Iran had, according to Israeli intelligence, 2,000 ballistic missiles in its arsenal, right? They fired 550 of them at Israel during the war. I think 3 dozen, maybe more, got through and caused a lot of damage, but it could have been a lot worse, as listeners of this podcast are fully aware. And that the post-war assessments by Israeli intelligence said that basically either half to 2/3 of Iran's missile stockpile was destroyed during the war. So between half and 2/3 of the stockpile destroyed, 200 missile launchers were hit. So distinct from the actual missiles, you need launchers, and that's a real bottleneck in terms of just military operations. So 200 launchers were hit by Israel during the war. That's 2/3, according to the IDF, of the total number of launchers that Iran had. And that's not even including kind of the missile production facilities and other equipment. So my question to you, Naysan, I don't know if there's a real answer, but I'm raising all of these numbers and data points to query whether it's actually credible that Iran reconstituted its entire ballistic missile arsenal over the past 6 months since the June war.
I think part of the question would be, how accurate were those assessments prior to the war? I mean, you will remember, because I'm pretty sure you reported on it, that, after the Israeli strikes in October of 2024, there was a suggestion that Iran's capacity to create ballistic missiles, certainly some of the more advanced solid fuel variants, had been substantially curtailed, right? And then in June, we've gone from, there's been a significant degradation of Iran's capacity to produce ballistic missiles to Iran is actively and successfully ramping up its ballistic missile production. So we know that the Iranians certainly are claiming to be rebuilding their ballistic missile capacity. We know that there's evidence of sodium percholate imports from China that can be used for ballistic missile development. It's also a question of which variants of which missiles did they use? Did they fire their top tier stuff, or how much of their top tier stuff did they fire versus the kind of medium term stuff? The drones were almost entirely ineffectual.
Right.
But it's also, and you know this far better than I do, that if you look at it numerically, the Israeli defenses were extremely robust. I think 86% intercept rates. It was running 90 plus throughout the first several days of the war, kind of dropped off a little bit towards the end. There were impacts at a few places. There was, the refinery in Haifa, the Weizmann Institute, a few other, the hospital in Beersheba. But the fact that they were able to maintain this pace, even if it ebbed and flowed in terms of actual numbers and actual damage, for 2 weeks, is I think Israeli officials would probably say that under the circumstances, it was as robust a defense as could have been hoped for, and in terms of offensive capacity, neutralized as much as could have been done. Question is, in isolation, how much of a threat does it pose, right? And especially if it's separate from the nuclear program. And that's a judgment for, Israeli officials and their assessments, because the Iranians will say that they are rebuilding at a rapid pace, and that their ballistic missile capacity and their defensive capacity, if you believe that, is better off today than it was on the 12th of June. Whether that is actually true is a very open question.
Do you believe it to be true?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I think it's the element of the Iranian national security doctrine that they have the most control over, because the axis is not in the condition it was before, certainly in terms of Hezbollah, certainly in terms of Hamas. The Houthis probably fared rather better than the rest of the axis did. The nuclear program as leverage right now, again, is mostly in terms of its opacity, not its growth. So the ballistic missiles, and given that Iran doesn't really have a functioning air force, certainly not one that could threaten Israel, means that by process of elimination, if you're going to invest in reconstituting something, the ballistic missile capacity is the only one that you really have at your disposal. And a lot of it, notwithstanding the reliance on Chinese imports for sodium percholate and elements that are used in part of the fleet, it is the one that they have the most control over, arguably. So it stands to reason that if they were looking to rehabilitate one element, the missile element would be the one that they would put the quickest and fastest investment in.
Right.
And so that all stands to reason. How effective they would be, how much the balance is against Israel's defensive capabilities. We know that the U.S. burned through a lot of munitions. We know that the Israelis burned through a lot of defensive munitions during the course of the war as well. If there were to be an Iranian salvo on the orders that it were in June, would the Israeli defenses be as robust, and for how long as they were in June? Those are technical questions to military experts that would have to have better access to information than I necessarily do. But I think that at the very least the rehabilitation trend line seems to be on the missile front, something that there's a convergence of what the Iranians say and what the Israelis believe.
Yeah, and there's also major scope in that Venn diagram for miscalculation, that the Iranians play up the numbers and capabilities. The Israelis either believe it or see something that spooks them. And then maybe someone here on this end decides that it's a big enough risk, or a big enough threat, rather, to pull the trigger with U.S. support. By the way, I don't think this is a likely scenario in the coming months. So just to kind of calm everybody down, but there is a risk here of miscalculation.
I think that's very true, and it's funny because we think of the U.S. and Iran as having no diplomatic relations and oftentimes being at loggerheads. But there are mediators, there are intermediaries, there is a special interest section. There's a back channel. There's a break glass in case of emergency at the Swiss embassy in Tehran, which is serves U.S. As the U.S. special interest section. We know that over the course of the negotiations between the Trump administration and Iran, Special Envoy Witkoff and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi were in touch directly. We know that the Iranians apparently gave the U.S. Heads up when they were retaliating
Qatar.
Against Qatar. With the Israelis, none of that really exists, which makes interesting the fact that there have been multiple reports over the past few months about messages going through Moscow.
Exactly.
Which again, and you know this because you've covered it. There was an element of deconfliction indirectly in Syria when we had the war between the war campaign about a decade ago. And again, if the Israelis if the Iranians, for example, are doing military exercises, and you're an Israeli planner, you see a lot of things moving into place, and you might be concerned. And if you're the Iranians and you see the Israelis doing military exercises or statements, or the fact that from the Iranian perspective, the 13th of June had a major element of surprise, right? Because they thought that they were still going to negotiate with the Americans on the Sunday when the attack was conducted on Friday. So there is, potentially always an element of a ruse or misdirection, and Israel has an ability to mount a fairly significant campaign on fairly short order. So I think that's right. Even if neither side necessarily wants to start off a second round, or depending on how you count it, a fourth round. This is one of the perennial questions when you have two adversaries with, forget about any trust, but any basic communication or deconfliction lines as well.
And the scenario that we hear, especially in recent days on this end, via certain reporters and certain leaks, of Iran actually itself launching a surprise preemptive attack, whether due to Israeli moves or U.S. moves, either at Israel directly or U.S. bases, that they're going to kind of shoot off what they have, as you mentioned, ballistic missiles and other kind of projectiles. And then, I don't know, hope for the best, I suppose. How credible do you think that scenario is?
I think hoping for the best, if that's the thinking, is potentially quite disastrous. The Iranians have, for example, they have, in the context of attacks, by ISIS in Syria, they've bombed Syria. Attacks by ISIS in Iran, they bombed Syria. When there were Jaish al-Adl attacks, like separatist attacks in the southeast of Tehran, they bombed Pakistan. They've bombed Kurdish bases. They bombed Erbil, claiming that these were Israeli intelligence hubs, Mossad hubs, without obviously offering much evidence to that extent. So there is precedent in Iran conducting extraterritorial strikes in response to domestic developments. Certainly some people in the system are saying that the current round of protests is orchestrated by the U.S. and Israel, as they always do. But it would be hugely risky, given that their air defenses, as far as we know, are not better off than they were in June.
It's a nice way of putting it. Yeah.
The vulnerabilities are pretty stark, right? So if those analyses that you're referencing are correct, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are some people in Tehran who are either arguing that next time it has to be us who goes first, or see signals that they take to mean an immediate Israeli or U.S. strike, which again comes to the point about potential miscalculations. But I think once you get the first move off, you have to anticipate the the other side's first move, and Iran, given what we saw in June, would take a significant hit in the event of a second round.
Right. I should have just sharpened my question to you. The scenarios that are being leaked here, the concern on this end in Israel is that as a result of the domestic unrest in Iran, that Iran may choose, for whatever reason, to try to divert attention externally and start firing missiles at whoever. Which again, I don't know how that would work as well, because then you run the risk of a real response by Israel, the Americans, someone else.
And I would just say, because I think it bears to the point that we started on, which is that, after June, one of the things the Iranian state really tried to cultivate was this sense of, rally around the flag, or if not even the flag, like if not even in support of the system, then at least in the name of the soil, right? In the name of territorial integrity, that, even if you're against us as the regime, you shouldn't be happy about the country being bombed type of thing.
Right.
And to the extent that that may have taken some root, I think the protests now that we've seen over the past kind of 7, 8, 9 days show that that doesn't really work when the fundamentals are still so poor, right? So kind of pleading unity does not resonate all that well when the economic, political, and social discontent is unaddressed. And you see some commentators in Iran that have kind of said, well, we should have used this moment to actually start to make some adaptations and maybe start to, talk to the Americans in a different way, or use that moment to make difficult calls on the economy and things like that. Hindsight is 20/20, but I think that it does show that this, like, if the state tried to use that, and if it would try to use that logic again, per what these leaked reports suggest, even then it would be a very finite resource, I think, without shifts in the issues that people are actually protesting about.
Okay, fair enough. Final question to you, Naysan, before I let you go, and it's about the Donald Trump of it all. So the first part of the question, when you hear the U.S. president make these comments and make these threats, saying that, how did he put it overnight? If they start killing people like they have in the past, I think they're going to get hit very hard by the United States. What tools does Trump actually have in his toolbox to make good on those threats, if he does actually make good on them? That's the first part of the question. And then the second part of the question, I think you already know what it is, right? Stemming from this Saturday's events in Caracas in Venezuela, the Nicolas Maduro snatch and grab, the supreme leader, the other officials of the Islamic Republic saw it, like everyone else around the world saw it. What's going through their mind? What impact does the event in Venezuela have on their thinking, again, if at all?
I think it does and should, because, look, and I think that the two elements of the question are very much complementary, because I think rendition of a head of state is, one end of a spectrum of, potential responses, right? So when the president says, if Iran continues down this path of repressing, they could be hit hard. We know what precedents exist. We know that there's sanctions designations that could be done. We know that there's, after there could be increased support to satellite communication and things like that, in case the government tries to curtail access to the internet again. And under in the Masa Amini protests, Iran was kicked out of some international human rights fora and things like that. Then you get into perhaps covert or overt operations, and for the Iranians, I think what happens in Caracas kind of underscores a point. It doesn't really make a new one. Trump is the one who made the decision to kill Qasem Soleimani 6 years ago. He's the one who agreed to carry out strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities in June.
Mm-hmm.
So he is not averse to making big calls with big consequences.
Right.
And I think, from if you're in Tehran, I think the issue is you don't know what's bluster, what's bluff, what's threat, and what options are on the table, because his nature has this unpredictable element to it. Now, there are other lessons people in Tehran might take as well, right? We know that Maduro was talking to Trump, right? They were trying to negotiate with Trump. And whatever Maduro was willing to offer clearly wasn't sufficient for what Trump expected. And so there are people in Tehran, I assume, who will also make that argument, that see, like, this is entirely futile. Like, don't even think about talking to this guy because it won't go anywhere.
Mm.
That's one element of it. And the other element of it is that he doesn't necessarily bluff. And to come back to the June war, we know that Iranian leadership was in Israeli crosshairs. Both Khamenei, who I think some Israeli officials said, he'd gone underground, and if we'd had him in our sights, we probably would have taken him out. Two, apparently, striking the Supreme National Security Council, with President Pezeshkian being injured. An effort, at least, towards decapitating not just the military and nuclear echelons of the Iranian system, but also its political echelon, was not entirely untried in June. And so that means that, again, in the context of what a U.S. and or Israeli operation could look like down the ground, like, we've already kind of crossed some of these thresholds, not just in Caracas, but in Tehran itself over the past few months.
So nothing new, but the Caracas precedent combined with the domestic unrest should increase the paranoia in Tehran. And as someone once said, paranoia, it's just another word for being mildly observant. So they've been observing these threats, and the U.S. president making good on these threats for quite some time. So in their minds, I suppose you're saying that it could actually get to a decapitation attempt.
I'm not saying that it could get to a decapitation attempt. I'm saying that what the Iranians certainly can't take away is ruling any of these things out at this point. And when it comes to the protests, I mean, to put a bow on the conversation, and going back to where we started, we've talked about the playbook that the Iranian system usually uses, which is a little bit of conciliatory language and a very heavy iron fist. And what the president has said is that I'm not going to let you get away with an iron fist. I mean, they already have to a certain extent, right? There's been at least 20 fatalities, and continued as we speak. There's still clashes and repression that is ongoing. So, what exactly the threshold would be for the president to contemplate some kind of hitting them hard remains to be seen. But I think, again, if you're an Iranian decision maker and you have this playbook that you've used in multiple rounds of past protests, which is, if you crack down hard enough, strong enough, long enough, it will eventually peter out in terms of a immediate security concern, if not a governance problem, which I think just continues to get worse, then you have this way that you've approached threats from below. But now you have this X factor where using that playbook now potentially invites an intervention from abroad, which wasn't the case in 2017, 18, 19, 2022, right? Like, at no point in any of those protests was there a serious probability, let alone likelihood, that there would be some kind of potential military intervention against those protests. And now, at the very least, it's something that they have to have in back of mind.
And that could lead them to a bit of pause with regard to their response if these protests continue and grow.
And then it becomes a catch-22. If you're holding on the repression and the protests continue to get worse, but repressing further could lead to an intervention that's coming from outside, you really are in a bit of a quandary. And I think, again, I think if you look at this dilemma and the other dilemmas that we've mentioned in terms of Iran's wider security concerns and its diplomatic impasse, it really has been a trend line of bad choices that continue to get worse.
Indeed, bad choices, most of which are self-inflicted. So maybe they will change course, although I'm not holding my breath. Naysan, as always, thank you very much for your time and your insights. Best of luck this season with Arsenal Football Club. I don't really mean that, but I suppose I have to say that just for the record.
I don't believe it, but anyway.
Right. And I'll chat with you hopefully very soon. Take care.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks again to Naysan Rafati, as always, for his generous time and insights once again. Also, special thanks to our producer, Jacob Gilman, our editor, Tracy Levy, and our assistant producer, Eden Jesselson, as always, and to all of you who support Israel Policy Forum's work. Do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum so it can keep being a credible source of analysis and ideas on issues such as these that we all care deeply about, including this podcast. And most importantly, thank you for listening, and please subscribe and spread the word.